David, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. My name's David Skrbina. I'm a philosopher. Taught for about 18 years at the University of Michigan. I left there a few years ago. I'm currently working at the University of Helsinki in Finland, basically teaching courses in environmental philosophies, philosophy of sustainability, and philosophy of technology.
Cool. So the topic today was panpsychism and what's the other one? Physicalism. Could you tell me your position on those?
Right. So this is one of my original interests in philosophy. It goes back many years, back to my dissertation, back in the late 90s when I was working on it. And I was working on something called participatory philosophy, which was kind of, it was originated by Henryk Skolimowski, who was one of my mentors. And we were talking about how the human being, and in particular the human mind, is interactive in the world. And it doesn't just sort of receive things from the world. It's sort of as an interactive thing, maybe a constructive thing that sort of makes sense, makes a kind of reality. And this was sort of one of Skolimowski's important theses. And so, I was thinking about how to articulate that, and I was doing a little research in the background of that idea and how the mind works and how it interacts with things around us. And that naturally led to some extensions, right? About if humans have sort of these mental abilities, then it seems pretty clear that, well, animals must have them too, at least certainly the higher animals. And then, then you say, well, look, probably the so-called lower animals still have mental abilities, cognitive abilities. And so it makes sense that they have some ability to interact with the world and maybe create a sort of reality themselves. Then you start looking at plants and you're saying, well, look, plants exhibit fairly intelligent behavior. And there was, new research at the time on the cognitive ability and the communication skills of plants. And they could anticipate changes and, threats to their existence and the weather and so forth. You think, well, okay, maybe plants have some ability to kind of do these things too. And then it's sort of, you're like, well, where does this process stop? Where these structures are getting increasingly simple. You can get simple plants are one-celled organisms, and they somehow have some ability to sort of understand, to rationalize, to cognitively grasp their environment and so forth. And so that sort of led to this idea of panpsychism, right? So panpsychism says that, well, look, this spectrum of mental abilities goes all the way down, right? It goes through humans, animals, plants, into non-living things, even into the simplest non-living structures. And this sort of dawned on me at some point in my PhD work. I thought, wow, that's kind of an interesting sort of crazy idea. I didn't even know about the term panpsychism at the time. And then I started digging around saying, well, I wonder if anybody else had this idea. And it turned out a lot of people did, going way back to ancient Greece. And so it was really a very interesting and enlightening. What at first was just a diversion for me became to be something very interesting and very important. This idea of mental abilities, psychic abilities, was a long-standing view through many of the greatest philosophers in history, going back 2,000 years. And they actually believe, seriously, were arguing that all things, all structures, had some kind of mental or cognitive ability. And so I was really intrigued. I thought that was kind of a strange and bizarre sort of idea, but I could kind of see that it made some sense, and it's had a sort of an intuitive logic to me. But of course, I was writing in the late 90s, early 2000s, and this is a very scientific, materialistic era. So, the dominant view in philosophy today is what we would call materialism or physicalism, which says that basically everything that exists, everything that's real is physical stuff. So it's matter, mass and energy, particles and waves and forces, right? All the stuff of physics. And it's a monist view. It says there's basically one sort of substance, this material stuff, maybe takes two forms, mass and energy, but basically the dominant materialist philosophy is a physicalist philosophy, and that's all that exists. and anything else is either a figment of somebody's imagination or an illusion or just a fantasy or whatever. So spirits and souls and gods and all this stuff, they don't make any sense because they're not constructed of ordinary matter. So the interesting challenge for me as a philosopher was kind of making sense of these two views, which it kind of seemed like maybe there was something to this panpsychist kind of idea, but of course here I am working in a physicalist environment, physicalist milieu, philosophically. And so I spend a lot of time trying to make sense of these, how do these things work together? Are they consistent? What kind of theories would work? I wanted to document the history of panpsychism to show that it was a well-established line of thinking, which no one had done up until that time. I started that in my dissertation. Eventually, that became my book, Panpsychism in the West, which was published, the first edition with MIT Press in 2005. And then it kind of kept building from there. So it's quite a popular and interesting movement in philosophy today. And I think it's really something important to discuss. It has lots of implications, metaphysical implications, ethical implications, and I think it deserves much more discussion than it's getting today.
Absolutely. So I am definitely in the physicalist materialist realm. So I think that everything is physical, and it's hard for me to imagine that consciousness exists outside of a brain or physical substrate of some kind. And it seems like all the evidence from my perspective would follow a hierarchy of like, in reality, you got the quantum fields, which is the fundamental stuff, and you got physics, chemistry, biology, brains. And then only after that do you get consciousness as an emergent property of brains. And so what is your impetus in order to try to why do you think that consciousness is more fundamental than simply just a product of physical stuff in some way? And how could it possibly exist in that way? And what would be the means by which it could interact with the physical world?
Right. Well, we have two basic issues there with what you just said. First of all, is the existence of mind or consciousness in itself is not a physical property. So it cannot be described physically. It cannot be described scientifically. It's not composed of particles and forces, as far as we can tell. The experiential aspect of consciousness, right? The sensations, the way things feel to us, sensory impressions, just emotional feelings, love and anger, and these kind of things. These seem to be indescribable in physicalist terms, and it's gotten to the point where even scientists tend to this eliminativist position where they're basically saying, look, we can't describe the mind or consciousness in physicalist terms, therefore it must not be real. So we actually have materialist philosophers like Paul Churchland is sort of a famous example, who basically said, look, your mind doesn't even exist. Your consciousness isn't even real. It's kind of an illusion because it's not a physical thing, and anything that's the only real stuff is physical stuff, and your consciousness is not like that. So it's just an illusion that you're living with on a day-to-day basis. So that's the first problem, is just the basic sense of human consciousness that everybody has doesn't fit into a physicalist worldview. That's a major problem for any scientist or physicalist philosopher. Simply cannot explain human consciousness, human mental phenomena. So that's the first major problem. The second problem is this emergentist view, which is what most people hold, if only by default. Maybe they aren't explicit, but they would basically say, well, look, mind is something that humans have, or maybe they're a little generous and they'll say, well, the higher animals have these mental abilities, right?
Or I would clarify that. I'd say that everything down to like flies, anything that has a brain probably has consciousness. So that'd be my position.
Okay. A brain, but how big of a brain, right? So there's a question, well, how many neurons does it take in your nervous system to count as a brain?
Yeah, so C. elegans would be debatable.
So no, right, exactly. So nobody has a good answer to that one. But in any case, it doesn't matter if you say 1 neuron or 1,000 neurons or 1 billion neurons. It doesn't matter. You can look back over the scope of evolutionary time, or even universal time. Go back, 15 billion years to the start of the Big Bang. And people would say, philosophers would be forced to say, well, look, there was no consciousness, no mind, no awareness, no mental phenomenon of any kind at the beginning of the universe for the first billion years, for the first 2 billion years, for the first 10 billion years, for the first, umpteen billion years, up until, so here comes this little one planet Earth, and then these little creatures start spinning around, and then somehow they get, they evolve a brain, and then suddenly suddenly, for the first time in the history of the universe, there's one little creature somewhere in the ocean somewhere, and suddenly, bing, this little light bulb goes on, and he's aware of his surroundings, and he has feelings like, he maybe a sense of desire, which would count as a mental phenomenon, or pain. Maybe he feels pain or dissatisfaction in an unhealthy, environment that he happens to be in. So the emergentist position is, for billions of years, there was nothing, absolutely nothing, no pain, no desire, no wants, nothing that would count as a mental phenomenon. And then suddenly, one day in some ancient ocean, bing, that little light bulb went on, and now this first little swimming creature, he's got a mental process going on. And that is so crazy, and that's so bizarre, and nobody can explain how or why that can happen, that the emergentist theory, which basically everybody holds, it fails. Because it's such an inconceivable, it's like a miracle story. You might as well just saying, and then God woke up one day and said, now you're conscious. I mean, that's what you're reduced to. If you accept an emergentist view, it's basically a story of miracles, unexplained miracles, and suddenly a bolt comes down from heaven and says, "Okay, that little amoeba now you're conscious and you're feeling something." Yeah, that makes no sense. So any emergentist theory has got to struggle with this miraculous, magical world view, which says that this suddenly happened. It's far more logical and far more plausible to say, well, look, there was experientiality inherent in all matter from the very beginning, way back 15 billion years ago, or whatever the start of the universe is, right? And then as matter increased in complexity and structure, so too did the level of consciousness or awareness or the mind of those structures. So that, simplest, even atomic structures or subatomic structures had associated with them a kind of mental aspect or some kind of awareness or some kind of desire or something like that at a very low level that built up over time in complexity as material structures built up over time in their complexity. That's a far more logical, far more plausible thesis, and that's a panpsychist thesis, than any kind of miraculous emergence. And conventional philosophers don't want to discuss this because they have no answer to it. It makes them sound foolish because they're endorsing a kind of miraculous, mysterious, magical worldview of this kind of emergence of mind from nothing. And so just even on a logical, rational basis, the panpsychist thesis is far more plausible than the only alternative, which is the emergentist thesis.
So I have a number of questions there. You said the two problems were that we can't explain consciousness in a physical world. We don't have the means to express how it is a result of physical processes, and how is it emergent from physical processes? When did it emerge? Right. And I don't see those as really big problems, because it seems like most things are emergent. So like stars didn't exist for the first 300 million years or whatever. Black holes didn't exist till several hundred million years after that. Planets didn't exist, rivers didn't exist, storms, particles, everything seems to be emergent from more fundamental processes. And so to assume that like consciousness or any given phenomenon that we discover that we don't know what it is or what caused it, it seems rational to infer that it's going to be an emergent thing, and that seems to be a better position to hold than to say it's a fundamental thing. It seems like the argument you presented could apply to anything that we don't know how to explain or can't logically explain given our current knowledge. And if we have such an object, then using your argument, we should infer that it's always fundamental to the nature of reality. So if we discovered a star or something, and before we knew anything about stars or how they could possibly exist, so like say 3,000 years ago, we see this, we discovered like the sun, and the sun is thousands of times bigger than the earth, and we just have no way to explain that. We know nothing of physics. It seems like, given that our worldview has no means to explain it, we could use the methodology you provided to infer that the universe must have sunness. There must be some sunness property in the universe. And that seems very strange to me. I don't think like inferring fundamentality is ever rationally justified. I don't think you can ever infer that there's something that must be fundamental to the nature of reality other than existence itself. It seems like anything we discover is more rational to infer is emergent. secondly, I think that you said that your view is more rational than the view that it's emergent. Now, there's the two kinds of emergence, strong emergence and weak emergence. And obviously strong emergence is literally just magic. It's what it is. But I don't see how even that is less rational than your view. So let's say that consciousness is fundamental as opposed to conscious being fundamentally strongly emergent, just magically emergent. Why would one case be more rational than the other? Essentially, you're positing some ontological entity existing either eternally from the beginning of the universe with no cause, or positing that it came about at some point with no cause. And either way, it seems like you have equally the same problem. And so I think this is one of the problems I see with fundamental arguments, is that if you're positing some fundamental entity, it's essentially, I don't see any epistemic difference between that and just saying it's strongly emergent at time t. So why would thinking that it's fundamental in any way be more rational than to say it's strongly emergent at time t?
Right. Okay. So again, two issues, right? So you're right to point out that there are generally considered two kinds of emergence, right? So you can call it strong or weak, or brute and whatever kind of emergence. But you're right. I mean, structures do emerge that don't exist. Stars, planets, life forms. Obviously, there was a point in time when those did not exist, and then there was a point in time which they did exist. So somehow they emerged. They came into being when previously they did not exist, right? And so the counter argument is, well, look. Yeah, basically everything you see around you, all life forms, all structures, everything of those things are emergent from simpler atomic particles or whatever. But that's a weak or a soft kind of emergence, right? So we understand, and conceptually we can get from subatomic particles to atomic particles to molecules to complex molecules. We can explain more or less all the steps that go from the simplest all the way up to stars, planets, simple life, complex life, and so forth. So we have a plausible story about how almost all emergence works. And that's what you're talking about. And that's fine. Yeah, okay. I'm not denying that those things happen, that there is that kind of emergence. The problem is there's some things in the universe that we cannot explain that, right? One of those is space. So it's not plausible to argue how that spatiality could emerge from a non-spatial universe. It seems like space was somehow always intrinsic into the existence of reality. And maybe time is a similar thing, right? It's hard to imagine how time could emerge in a completely atemporal universe. So some things are like elemental structures that seem to be part of the reality of the cosmos, but they aren't plausibly emergent. People don't argue that
so just to clarify, space is, the consensus in physics is that space-time is actually emergent from quantum fields. So I don't see any examples of anything that we can't say is emergent other than existence, reality, energy maybe, but even that could be argued to be emergent. So I don't understand that argument specifically, that there's something that we can't argue is emergent, because to me it seems like anything's open game to call emergent. Space and time are emergent. Causation is emergent in many different models of physics. And so I don't see this class of things that are like irreducibly complex to give it
there are speculations, right, that you could look at string theory or brains or something sort of more primitive, right? That doesn't really solve your problem. That really just pushes it back a level, right? I mean, that's the same thing with
well, what's the problem there? So like I don't see a problem with pushing it back.
Well, the basic problem is you have, in any scheme of reality, you have elemental axiomatic entities, whether they're particles or forces or fields or quantum entities or whatever. And so you always have something that's at the core, that's built into the assumption of your system of reality.
Sure.
And you can't avoid it. Unless we're talking about sort of really purely speculative, emergence from nothing. There's literally nothing, and then but even those are sort of incoherent. So any plausibly coherent scheme that I'm aware of has some fundamental entities. I mean, usually in conventional physics, it's mass, it's force, its electric charge, its spin, right? These are basic physical entities which are considered brute entities, which do not arise from something simpler. Even the charge of an electron has no components. There seems to be no component structure to an electron. It's like an elemental. It's a lepton. It's an elemental entity which does not derive from simpler things. Protons derive from quarks. Quarks seem to be elemental entities which do not derive from simpler entities. They could just, but we don't know it. But as far as we know today, there are these elemental entities and elemental forces and quantities which don't evolve, don't emerge from anything else. They're the givens of your structure of reality. And from these things, we have a plausible story how all physical structures build up. But the argument is that consciousness does not fit into that scheme anywhere. Conscious awareness, subjective feelings, subjectivity, qualia, right? We have different expressions for it in philosophy. These things do not fit into the existing physicalist structure of the universe. So the plausible alternative is that it was one more aspect, whatever those handful of elemental quantities were that we talk about, quantum fields and particles or elementary forces. It makes sense to say, well, look, there has to be an experiential aspect which is also elemental, that's co-equal with these handful of physical elemental entities that explain the universe that we have. And I think that's the argument. And I don't know that there's any good counter argument to that, at least at this time.
Well, my question would be, why do you think it's rational to say that that's co-equal? Because it seems like the methodology to establish that quarks and muons and gluons and fermions, et cetera, are the fundamental things seems to be from a consistent methodology of novel predictions made with confirmable empirical results, whereas your methodology seems to be we can't explain it even logically in principle yet, therefore it must be fundamental. And I don't think that methodology of simply saying we can't explain it yet, even in principle, gives a justification to assert that it must be fundamental. Because I mean, that would mean that anything we can't explain,
well, of course, if you look into the future and say, well, look, anything could change in the future. We might figure out anything in the future. We might realize that there's another supernatural dimension, or we might figure out there's gods and spirits. I don't know what we're going to figure out in the future. So the future, anything holds. What you have to look at is what you have today. And what you have today is a range of possibilities, and some are plausible, more plausible, and some are less plausible. And some sort of, as things stand today, hold the status of most plausible theories. I don't think anybody really holds to absolute truth anymore. We kind of ditched that, since Popper at least. But you have sort of the most plausible, the most coherent thesis as things stand today. I think something like consciousness as fundamental entity is the most plausible default thesis that we can hold today. That could change, but I think from what we know, we cannot explain how conscious awareness, subjectivity could arise from quantum fields and so forth. We have no concept of how that's possible. Maybe in 100 years we will, but today we don't. So today it looks like it's a fundamental entity. That would seem to make it the default thesis and put the burden of proof on the physicalist thesis, which says, look, if you don't think that that's true, you have to come up with a plausible explanation as to how you're going to get from quantum fields to conscious awareness, because our view is that doesn't seem to be coherent. If you can explain it, good luck to you. Maybe you'll win a Nobel Prize if you can do that. But for now, you have an impossible task. So the default thesis has to be the panpsychist thesis, and the burden of proof is on the physicalist to explain how the consciousness arises from that physicalist conception.
Well, so the part that I'm struggling with is when you say we can't explain it now, and then there's some kind of inferential connection to therefore it's fundamental, or therefore it's rational to think it's fundamental. And that's the part I'm really missing here, because the fact that it seems like just a straight up argument from ignorance from my perspective, what we're saying, we don't know, therefore it's fundamental, or something along those lines. And so I think, I don't understand why you think it would be less rational to posit, yeah, it's probably a physical thing we don't understand yet, given our inductive justifications of how reality works, and given anything we don't know, we could probably always just rationally assume, yeah, it's probably a physical thing we don't understand yet. And why that would be less rational than to say it's actually some new ontology or some fundamental ontology just because we don't understand it.
Well, look, you have to look at the two options today, and there's only two. It's the emergentist option or the panpsychist option, and we have to say which of those is more plausible. What we know today, and the emergentist one says there is nothing, 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 bing, and then a light bulb goes on, and some little creature that's swimming around in the ocean, 180 million years ago. Okay, so you have to explain what happened that day, that morning, that little amoeba that was swimming in some little pool in some ancient pond. Suddenly, Bing decides he's suddenly aware of things. I mean, that's so absurd and so impossible to explain. How one day he did and one day he didn't, or what little baby creature that its parents weren't conscious. Suddenly, that one was a little bit more complex, and then Bing, suddenly he's consciously aware. I mean, that's just an absurd story on its face, and no one wants to deal with.
What do you mean by absurdity? Because
how is that even plausible?
Well, I would say
parent organisms with absolutely no conscious awareness, no sensation, no feeling, no wants, no desires, no pleasure, no pain, and then suddenly there's a baby that's born, a little one-cell baby that Bing, suddenly he wants something and he feels pain, and that never existed in the history of the universe before, but now that little one-celled creature does. That's an absurd theory. Nobody in their right mind will defend that theory.
Well, I don't see how that's different from saying there was organisms with no wings and then wings evolved, or there are organisms with no hearts and hearts evolved.
Well, of course there are. There's a myriad intermediate forms of wings to no wings. Same with eye. People would say, well, look, where did eyes come from? Well, we have all kinds of, conceptual stages, and we have even some fossil record of evolution of organisms to skin-covered organisms to transparent skin-covered organisms to, indentations that became convex, that became the body of the eye. We have evidence and we have a plausible story that how it went from no eyes to organisms having eyes, and nothing with wings to having wings. You don't have like a lizard that suddenly had a baby that boom has full-blown wings and he's flying around the next morning. That would be ridiculous. Nobody would argue that. You would be laughed off the stage if you tried to argue that you had wingless lizards and suddenly a baby, boom, here he has wings, and now look at him, he's flying. Well, that's ridiculous.
But it seems like that seems like a straw man. That seems like a straw man. Seems like a complete straw man. So the argument here is that consciousness is kind of like the evolution of the eye, where you have a single cell that's divided in such a way that it interacts with light, and then that evolves into a full-blown eye. But it didn't just pop. Eyes didn't pop into existence. And so evolution of consciousness would essentially be the same thing, whereas there's some intermediate beginning stage that is really not consciousness, but it can then evolve into what we think of as conscious experience is the full breadth of consciousness, like the eye is the full breadth of what we think of as vision.
There's no such thing as being an intermediate conscious awareness. As far as we know, there's no conception of being a little bit. It's like being a little bit pregnant, okay? You can't be a little bit aware. You can't be a little bit in pain. If you're a little bit in pain, that's pain, and that counts.
Wait, one sec. So there's no intermediate to being able to interact with photons. You either do or you don't. Sight is the same thing. It's either 100% on or 100% off. There's no intermediate between no sight and sight. It's a black and white. But there are obviously, once you have sight, there's a different levels to it, different complexities to it. And so I don't see why saying consciousness is the exact same as eyesight would be, or wings or hearts, where there's no heart and then it starts to evolve and there's little tiny bits of it, and then you get the full complex breadth of consciousness, that there's any problem there. So essentially, I imagine you're going to take some position like the consciousness in the universe isn't like a fully developed consciousness. It's like some smaller amount, and then it becomes fully developed in brains or something. Many different panpsychists take that view, where there's like proto-conscious particles or something. And I think that we can make the same argument and just get rid of it being fundamental and say there are proto-conscious properties that are emergent. And so I don't see why saying that consciousness evolved and then from one day there was no consciousness to the next day there was is any fundamentally different than saying one day there was no eyesight or eyes and the next day there was. I think it's my hypothesis is that it's weakly emergent, so I don't think it's strongly emergent. And I think that that's the most rational position. I don't understand, even though I give you no explanation of the story of how it happened. It doesn't seem like I need to do that. I can just say that positing that it's the same kind of a thing as all the other things that we've seen that have become emergent, even if I don't know how, seems like a better explanation than to say it's a new ontology that's the fundamental nature of reality. That seems to hold like a much higher burden of proof than just you can't explain it, therefore it's fundamental. Again, that seems like I don't think that even counts as a rational justification at all. So it's, from my perspective, it seems like the from the starting position, we know nothing about it other than it exists. It's based on our prior information. It seems more rational to infer it's like all of the other stuff that we've interacted with, that it's emergent, rather than it's some new kind of fundamental ontology. Because to posit a new kind of ontology seems to hold a much higher epistemic burden of proof that you need to justify before that becomes rational. It can't be the default.
It's not a new kind of ontology. It's a very old kind of ontology.
What?
It's not new to posit that mind is fundamental in reality. So that's a very ancient idea.
So to clarify, I don't mean like
it's actually a radically new idea that says only physical things exist. That's the radically new thesis. Okay. So just to keep things in perspective from a historical time, right?
Right. So by new, I don't mean like historically new. I mean new as in things that we have been verified to exist are independent of our imagination. So if we're talking about qualities in reality, matter, energy, motion, spin, electromagnetism, those things are very like, those would be like the old things, the things we have strong evidence these exist independent of our imagination. Fundamental properties, we don't have any evidence they exist. Like the things in physics you listed, they don't even claim that these are fundamental. This is just the most fundamental we have so far. They can always be emergent from somebody else. Nobody in physics claims this is absolutely fundamental. And so if you're claiming that there's some fundamental force to all of reality, that seems like a new ontology whenever you make such a claim like that. And so I'd say that.
But that's what I said. Yes, today every theory has fundamental entities. And I don't know if they're happy with that or not, but everybody's forced to work with those fundamental entities. And you could say, yeah, okay, maybe tomorrow some bright guy reduces two fundamental entities to one simpler fundamental entity. Okay, well, he reduced the number, but there's still a fundamental entity. I don't think they're going to reduce it down to nothing. So you're going to always have some kind of fundamental entities in your picture, your cosmic picture, your ontological picture of the world, right?
Sure.
So I don't know that that's a problem. I don't know that people view that as it's kind of just a sort of an interesting thing to wonder about what the nature of these things are, and maybe they do indicate that we have things that we don't know and that we have further progress to make down the road. And I think panpsychists too are open to the idea that maybe consciousness, awareness, and experientiality maybe someday would be plausibly reduced to or shown to emerge from what would be considered purely physical, non-experiential entities, because that's what it would take. So I think, in principle, we're open to that, say, well, okay, maybe someday that could happen. In theory, that could happen. Today, we have nothing. We have absolutely nothing, absolutely zero. I'm talking philosophers of mind who do this for a living, they do this full time for decades. They have zero, nothing. I'm telling you, nothing, no plausible solution how mind or experientiality emerges or reduces to completely non-experiential entities, whatever you want to call it. And they're reduced to saying what you said. Well, look, a billion years ago, there was no consciousness, and today there is. So, well, clearly it must have emerged somewhere in between, and I don't have to worry about when or where. That's
right. So I agree with everything you said there.
Doing,
right? But my question is more, and this is an epistemic question. It's saying, what is the methodology that justifies anything? Like if we came up with any new undiscovered or any new property in the universe, we didn't know what it was. What in that thing could we see that could justify us in claiming that it's fundamental? And from my perspective, it seems the fact that we can't in principle explain it yet does not seem to do that. It doesn't seem like here's something we can't in principle explain, therefore it's fundamental is a valid argument. It seems like an argument from ignorance. Now, in the case of physics, if we say the reason we think quantum fields are fundamental is because it's just the smallest thing we found yet. That's it. That's the only justification. We keep going down, we go down, and all the math seems to work at this kind of a thing, and there's just nothing smaller yet, and that's it. And that's the only justification we have. That seems perfectly rational. We're not saying it's fundamental. We're not trying to skip $200 and just say it's fundamental because we can't explain it. The reason it's fundamental is because it's the smallest thing we've discovered yet, and that's it. And so I don't see why in the case of consciousness, it would be justified to say it's fundamental. I do see why it's justified in the case of quantum fields. And it seems like the methodology you're providing is that because we can't fundamentally explain it with any of the other stuff, therefore it's rational to infer it's fundamental. That's the argument I'm trying to understand why that would be more rational, or like my original question is, if we discovered something new, what is the properties in that thing that we could rationally infer it's fundamental?
Well, we have good examples. We don't have to speculate. We have the most recent fundamental entities in physics have been discovered in the last 20 or 25 years, and that's dark matter and dark energy. So we know these things must exist. Dark matter, right, is the unseen matter that holds the galaxies together, because otherwise they would spin apart. Dark energy is a repulsive force that causes the increasing acceleration of the expansion of the universe. So these two forms of energy, dark matter and dark energy, according to the physicists, is about 96% of the total reality.
Sure.
And the ordinary matter stuff that you're talking about is about 4% of the total reality of the universe. So just in the last 30 years, we came up with dark matter and dark energy, which do not reduce to any of those particles and forces that we knew about. We can't explain them. They seem to be fundamental. They're not little tiny things. They're vast things that work on the scale of the universe. Those may well be two more fundamental entities that we have to incorporate into our fundamental picture of what counts as real, because they're indisputably real. They have measurable, quantifiable effects. We just don't know what they are. So our catalog of fundamental entities is growing. It's growing by at least two in the last 30 years. Maybe some bright guy will reduce dark matter to something, maybe dark energy to something. We don't know. But as it stands today, those are fundamental, unexplained entities, which are indisputably real. So we accept them as brute aspects of our cosmological picture, right? I mean, that's a good example of how this stuff works.
Well, I think it's an interesting example. I don't think either of those are fundamental. I don't think anybody in physics thinks those are fundamental. I think those are phenomenon that are explained by higher emergent things. So like most of the theories of dark matter are WIMPs, weakly emergent massive, or weakly interactive massive particles.
Right.
And those aren't fundamental at all. Those are the same kinds of things that are built of gluons and fermions and bosons as everything else. Nothing about them is fundamental. Nobody thinks that the fact that there's excess gravitational force holding galaxies together is fundamental in the universe. Nobody thinks that. They think it's caused by something else, which is caused by something else.
But
same with dark energy.
Nobody has a physical theory that I'm aware of. Maybe you're more into physics than I am. Nobody has a physical theory that reduces dark matter to one of the known forms of matter and energy. Same with dark energy. Nobody has any theory that reduces dark energy to existing forms of matter and energy.
Right.
I'm fairly sure that does not exist anywhere in the realm of physics.
So they do posit it as another kind of a particle, which is a composite of more fundamental things built by quantum fields. So it's not, they aren't positing this as fundamental. Nobody's saying that this was present at the Big Bang. That's not the argument. The argument was that this is another kind of matter, equally as emergent as bosons, fermions, particles of neutrons, protons. They're nobody's saying that dark matter and dark energy are fundamental concepts in reality. I
suspect they are, or they will be forced to that view once they realize that they cannot reduce those things to fermions and bosons and quantum fields, because so far they cannot do that. So you can carry this on forever. I mean, it's the same sort of story. It's this wishful thinking story. You could say, well, look, we know what's real is fermion, bosons, but subatomic particles and quantum fields, and now we have this dark matter and dark energy. Well, therefore, they must be composed of these things. That's just wishful thinking. You can just say, well, I guess that must be true. I don't know why or how, but it must be true. Well, that's nonsense. You get zero credibility if you put that theory out there. You have to explain how those things derive from the things that you think you know exist, or you are forced to accept those as fundamental entities, or it's just a miracle. Like, well, okay, God just went zoom and now there's dark energy. I mean, okay, that's ridiculous too. So you either have to explain how they connect. You can't just say, well, somehow in some mysterious way they reduce to particles and forces. No, that doesn't work. You either have to explain it, or you accept them as fundamental in your picture. There's no two ways about it.
Okay. So like in the case of dark matter and dark energy, we think they reduce to quantum fields. Do we know how? Nope. We have no idea how. But we think that they are
we hope they do. Fingers crossed. I guess they might. I hope they do, because otherwise we got a problem. Yeah, that's what it is.
Well, so I don't think it's not even rational to consider that they don't. So I don't think that's even a rational option. I think that.
Of course it is.
I don't.
How could that not be a rational option to say, look, we've realized that there's something real in the universe that we did not previously realize was real?
Because it's like if we have, say, all we know of is atoms, protons, neutrons, or whatever, and we discover some new thing out there in the universe. there's two possibilities. You can say either it's composed of matter in a way we don't know, or it's a new kind of a thing altogether. And if we say that it's a new kind of a thing altogether, that seems to be a hypothesis that has no background evidence whatsoever. If we say it's composed of protons, neutrons in a way we don't know yet, that seems to have tons of background data. So it's like if we see a hoof print in the snow and we say it's a horse, a horse caused the hoof prints, that seems to be rational. If we say a unicorn did it, totally irrational. You need more evidence for that. Same thing applies to this new ontology hypothesis. If you want to say something is a new ontology, that's like saying it's a unicorn, and it can never be justified by the observation of an unknown. You would need some other new novel testable predictions to confirm that. You could never simply say, here's an unknown, therefore unicorn. And so the same thing seems to apply to this new ontology hypothesis. If there's some unknown, dark matter, dark energy, you couldn't say it's a fundamental thing, just like you couldn't say it's a unicorn. You'd have to say, it could, I'm going to assume it's produced by the known stuff, and that seems rational. Or you could say, I have no idea, and that seems rational. But you could never say it's a fundamental thing. And the reason for that is because we don't have like a full knowledge of all different ways in which matter could combine. And so of the things, of the ways in which protons and neutrons could combine, we know maybe 10%, let's say. I don't know, that's probably small it's probably more like 1/1,000,000th of 1%, but let's say 10%. And so of the 90% of ways matter could combine, we don't know them. And this could be in that 90% of ways matter could combine that we haven't discovered yet. And that seems like a perfectly rational explanation because we don't know everything about matter. But if you want to posit a completely new ontology that seems equivalent to positing a unicorn to explain a hoof print, could this be a unicorn? Sure, absolutely. Unicorns could exist. I can't say they couldn't, but it seems like the less rational hypothesis than to say it's probably a combination of the known stuff that we just haven't discovered yet, because there's bunches of combinations of known stuff that we haven't discovered yet. And so I don't understand why you would infer that the new ontology route would be more plausible here.
The analogy, by the way, is horses versus zebras. So if you see a footprint in the snow, your first thought is horses, not zebras. But it could be zebras because maybe somebody escaped from the local zoo and actually it was a zebra. Okay, unicorn is slanting the argument because unicorns don't exist. So yeah, you're right. If you have partial evidence of something, the inference is existing common things versus unusual, exceptional things.
Well, and so just to clarify,
I'll grant you that point, right?
Well, I do want to push on the unicorn thing, because to me, the concept of fundamental property seems to be the unicorn that I'm talking about. Not consciousness. Consciousness obviously exists, so consciousness would be a unicorn, like a zebra. But the thing that I'm arguing is like the unicorn is saying that something is fundamental. That part is the part that I think is like a unicorn. Like there is no examples that we can say because of X, Y, and Z it's fundamental. Like that doesn't seem to be a thing in scientific research that I've seen. That's the unicorn I'm talking about.
But there are things that we accept as fundamental, which at some point in the not too distant past, we didn't even know existed. So you could take quantum spin, and that's generally considered a fundamental entity in physics today. And you go back 100 years, and somebody they had no concept of quantum spin, and somebody said, well, look, maybe these things, and there's some analogy to spinning. We don't think they're physically spinning, but some equivalent thing, and we now accept that as a real new fundamental entity. So I mean, we've done this many times in the past. I don't know what would give us the confidence to think, yep, now we're done, man. We've got all the fundamental entities and there's going to be no more because, we've got them all figured out now. That's like an incredibly arrogant view. It's been disproven countless times over the history of science. So you go back hundreds of years. You can try to take that view and say, look, man, we've got it all figured out. We know all the fundamental entities. There's no more allowed. The box is sealed and we can explain everything. I don't know anybody that's willing to take that kind of a view. I mean, in principle, you could just sort of throw that up for discussion, but I don't know any physicists who are willing to say our catalog of fundamental entities is done and finished and we're permanently fixed and there's never going to be a new one.
I agree. I totally agree. So the argument here is that the reason in physics we can claim those are fundamental is because it's the smallest thing that has successfully made novel testable predictions and got them right. That's it. That's the full criterion that I use to establish that it's plausible to claim something is fundamental. It's the smallest thing that can make successful novel testable predictions consistently. That's it. Now, consciousness, panpsychism doesn't seem to be able to do that, but I think that the problem is that your criterion for why we are trying to claim that consciousness fits in that category is because we can't explain it. So my standard for quantum fields is that smallest thing to successfully make novel testable predictions that can be confirmed in laboratory testable in conditions consistently. That seems rational. Now, obviously, I think that there could be smaller things, and I'm fine with that. I don't really care. Just like you're happy to posit that there could be smaller things in consciousness, and that's fine too. But mine seems to be based on the successful methodology, and so we can just grant it tentatively as being fundamental, and that's fine. But yours seems to be, we can't explain it, therefore it's fundamental, and that does not seem fine to me.
It's a question, what are the alternatives? This is what I said before. You got two competing theories, and you have to weigh them and say, since we're not talking about absolute truth and falsehood, we're talking about plausibility. Which one is the most plausible? Which can we make the most, logical, rational argument in defense of, versus a less defensible position? That's really what it comes down to. So that's why you have to kind of squarely face the issues of emergentism with the issues of panpsychism, which is consciousness as a kind of fundamental entity. And you have to kind of weigh those two and say, look, I can come up with a plausible story how consciousness can emerge from nothing. No philosopher in mind has been able to do that in the last 50 or 100 years at least. But you could try, and maybe you can come up with one.
Well, why do I need that?
If you cannot do that, then that pushes the plausibility of the fundamental nature of consciousness puts it in the lead. It gets it the higher status because you have no plausible conception of how the emergentist theory can really work. You can just say it's true, or you can say, well, it must be true, but that cuts no ice. That's the problem, right?
Well, I don't see why that's a problem. To me, it's like, I don't understand why I need to posit anything. I can just say it's emergent like the other things. I don't know how. And that seems on its own, with no explanation whatsoever, more plausible than saying it's
well, I can say God runs the universe, and I don't know how or why, but that's just how it works.
Right, but which hypothesis is that more like?
More plausible? I can invent any magical, mysterious sort of things and say, well, they're just there, and that's how they work, and I can't explain how or why, but they just do. And then you'll kick me off the show because I'm talking like nut job here.
I'd probably invite you on because we get more views,
but that's really what it is. You can just say, well, it must be there because I guess it must be, and I don't know why or how. I mean, that doesn't carry any weight. That's the problem.
Well, to me, that seems like exactly like what you're doing. So the God hypothesis, saying that, let's say I don't understand how tornadoes happen or something. I say God did it, and God works in my mind and intuitively makes sense. And in order for you to have a plausible alternative, you need to explain exactly what is causing the tornado. And if you can't do it, then mine wins by default. Well, that's obviously not a terrible argument, right? Like that wouldn't make any sense. And it seems like exactly what you're doing. So if I said, I think tornadoes are a naturally occurring process that are caused in a way from just the normal matter stuff. Do I know how? Nope. Am I going to posit a way now? Nope. I have no idea. It's just my internal hypothesis that it's going to be emergent just like all the other stuff. That seems to be more plausible than to say God did it, because God is a new entity that hasn't been empirically verified to exist independent of our imagination. Matter is, therefore matter wins on the plausibility scale. And it seems like the exact same thing would apply to consciousness here. If we want to say, what caused consciousness? We could ask the exact same question as what caused the tornado and say, I think it's just a natural process, just like all the other things. And you're saying, I think it's fundamental. And unless you can explain exactly some kind of materialistic process to explain that, then mine wins by default. That seems analogous to what the religious people are doing when saying, well, if you can't explain a natural way to cause this, therefore God wins as the explanation. I don't think that's how it works epistemically. It seems like for your alternative of saying consciousness is fundamental to be as plausible as saying that it's an unknown emergent property of matter, you would actually need novel testable predictions to actually confirm your hypothesis, like I have about matter. Otherwise, mine has defaults.
So here's another consideration to keep in mind. There is an argument, it's held by some panpsychists, Galen Strawson in particular, which says the mental or the experiential aspect of reality is more fundamental and more essential to the fabric of reality than any of this physical stuff, because all that you really know, your only sort of awareness of anything is the awareness itself, right? The conscious experience of things. Sure. It's a kind of argument for idealism, really, right? And so you can say, well, look, the most fundamental entity that we could even conceive of because it involves conception, and it involves, rationalization and cognition and so forth. So you could say, well, look, experientiality is the number one factor of existence. That's ahead of any of the physical stuff that you want to talk about, the little blips on your radar screen and your little particles and your masses and whatever you think that you can touch and feel out there in the world. So there's actually a very good argument that says, well, look, the mental aspect is the single fundamental aspect of existence, and that all this other stuff has to be explained as in addition to, or maybe emerging from, this experiential stuff, which is really the most basic fact of all existence. And that idea goes back to Descartes. It's an old idea. But it's a good argument. It's not an easily defeatable argument that says, well, look, this experientiality is the ultimate nature of reality in itself, and we're not even sure if there's anything else beyond some various forms of experiential nature, right? So kind of forms of subjectivity. So that puts the experiential aspect, the mental aspect, at a more fundamental level, not just co-equal with, mass and charge and spin and space and time. It puts it at a more fundamental level than any of those entities. And there's also that argument, which carries a lot of weight independently of the emergence arguments that we've been talking about.
Oh yeah, so I grant epistemic solipsism. I start from the position of consciousness. I'm happy to grant that, but I think that if all we have like initially is just our consciousness and we start with no other background knowledge, then yeah, absolutely, fully agree. That's the most primitive thing that we can use as a basis of hypothesis making. But then after there is some difference between my imagination and my experience. I imagine a unicorn, I don't see a unicorn. And we need to differentiate between which of the things that we are consciously experiencing are the experiential things and which are the imaginary things. And we find that many of the things we're experiencing are not real, they're fantasies of some kind. Now we know that our conscious experience isn't a reliable guide to reality, and so we have a good reason to say that the other methodology, whatever we're using to differentiate imagination from reality, is more primitive and better than using consciousness in and of itself as the basis. And so if we have competing hypotheses of one is using our direct conscious experience as the foundation of its reality, and one is using novel testable predictions, or our method to differentiate imagination from reality, as the fundamental basis of determining what's in reality, it seems like we're going to prefer the one that makes novel testable predictions over one that uses consciousness as its basis. And I think that's the more rational approach to take nowadays. And so even though I grant that we start with consciousness, we have now evolved a better methodology to trust than consciousness to determine what's real. Science.
Part of the problem is that's a self-serving definition, because it's inherent into the physicalist worldview that testable predictions is the ultimate standard by which we measure reality and so forth. And that's a self-serving definition. Obviously, if you allow physicalists to determine its own standards for validity, it's going to determine that what it does counts as the most valid criterion. So if you want empirical objective predictability, then you can say, well, look, yeah, exactly. Physicalism dictates the terms of measure, and it rates itself as number one in the hierarchy of possible ontologies. That's no surprise. That's a tautology. It's proving itself by declaring that plausibility and predictability is sort of are the essential criterion by which we measure reality. That was never historically. That was never considered a criterion by which you determine the validity of a particular ontology. It's a self-serving aspect of modern physicalism.
Well, why is that a problem? Because it seems to me like if we're trying to discover reality, the ability to predict the future before we know it, because our brains are very bad at that. We're not very good at predicting the future before we know it. And if you have some kind of a model that can do that consistently, it seems rational to infer that model corresponds to reality more than just our imagination, because our imagination is bad at predicting the future. Reality presumably is good at predicting the future. And so if we have a model that can predict the future, it's more likely correspondent to reality than our imagination. And so I don't see why that would be a bad thing to use as a basis of determining what ontology is or what anything is. I think it's the best way. It seems like that if you can accurately predict the future, that seems like the most plausible way to.
But historically, there's many ways to predict the future. They used to predict, Apollo brought the sun on a chariot through the sky, and that's to explain, the change from night to day. And Persephone arise from the underworld, and that caused the growth in the spring. I mean, they had theories, God theories about predicting things, weather cycles and strange phenomenon and night and day and so forth. So, I mean, they always had some kind of explanation. There's nothing unique there.
So
had explanations 2,000
just to clarify,
years ago.
I'm not talking about explanation. I'm talking about novel testable predictions, which is the ability to predict something we don't know yet about the future and get it right. So predicting the sun will come tomorrow, that's something we already know. So it's not novel. Yeah. Novel would be like, I'm going to predict the next earthquake, the next 6 earthquakes in a row. That would be great. Like if you could do that, whatever method you use, if it was shaking a magic 8-ball or appealing to a god, you have evidence now because you were able to accurately predict the future. And so whatever method you use to accurately predict the future is evidence. It may not be great, but it's evidence. And so any hypothesis, whatever it is, magic, unicorns, leprechauns, gods, whatever, that is able to accurately predict the future before you know it, I think is a justification for believing that the hypothesis is correct or corresponds to reality. And so that's why I think that method is the most rational reason to believe something is true in reality. It is for anything that can make predictions counts.
But even we can even grant that, even from the panpsychist perspective, we can completely grant that works great, it's wonderful, makes testable novel predictions. That's all within the realm of the physical aspect of reality. That's a kind of a closed, they call it causal closure of the physical. It's a closed physicalist system. And yeah, you can just in the nature of that system, which includes physical predictions and anticipations and maybe even novel physical phenomenon, that works within a closed system. But the problem is that it has no bearing on the experiential aspect, which does not fit into that closed causal picture. We have physical explanations, physical causation explanations for physical phenomena, but we don't have physical explanations for mental or conscious phenomena. That's the problem, right? So physics works good in its predictability aspect in its own sphere, and it says nothing about what's going on in the mind or consciousness, which is somehow outside that sphere.
Right, but I'm saying that independent of the consciousness question, we're trying to ask what's a reliable method to determine what's true of reality. And the method that I think we have established is that novel prediction is good. Novel prediction is a good way to establish X is true, whatever it is. And so you're saying that method.
We can grant you that. That's not really the point of discussion. We'll grant you that, Rob. Okay, fine. Yeah, go ahead. Right.
Well, so that method doesn't give us an answer to a particular question. So there's a particular question it doesn't give us the answer to. Now the question is there another method that can give us a reliable answer to this? And that's the part that I'm asking when you say that because we can't explain it with this reliable method, therefore it's fundamental. That's the part that makes no sense to me. I don't think that is so I agree that novel testable prediction does not give us an answer to what consciousness fundamentally is. Agreed. Now, the question is what's your method that's equivalent or better to answer this question than the novel testable prediction? And it seems like your method is we don't know, therefore consciousness.
It's usually phrased slightly differently. It would say, well, in a panpsychist universe, what is your kind of new novel predictions that you can produce that are comparable to what we can do in a physicalist universe? That's usually how the objection is framed, right? Because you could say, well, look, we demand novel predictability, and if you want to be a panpsychist, you have to show some evidence of novel predictability based on your panpsychist thesis, and then we'll believe you.
Sure.
That's usually how the objection is framed. It's similar to what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
And I guess the counter argument is, well, wait a minute, you're taking a toolbox from the physicalist universe and you're bringing it over here to the non-physicalist universe, and you're demanding that this tool works. And we're saying, well, look, that doesn't work. That's not an applicable tool. It's not appropriate to demand empirical novel predictability because that is a feature of a physicalist system. And we're not, and the hypothesis is this is not a physicalist system, so you can't take the same tools out of the old toolbox and apply them to this new system. It's not reasonable to demand, right, that these old tools will work under the new thesis. It's a self-serving assumption.
That's totally fair. I can totally agree with that, but I wouldn't say that that's the objection that I'm making here, or that most people are making in my case. Now, I think novel prediction is the only tool in my toolbox. If it doesn't do that, it's got no basis from my perspective. But if you think there's a different methodology that works to the same or works in the same kind of a way to justify beliefs. That's what I'm asking about. So I think novel prediction is the only tool that makes something rational or reliable to believe. And so obviously, if you had novel predictions, I'd believe it. But since you're saying that that tool doesn't work for this case, what's the other tool? Because to me, it seems like the other tool you're arguing for here is we can't explain it with this tool, therefore I'm right, which is argument from ignorance. I don't understand that.
What's the other tools? The other tools are introspection, by which you become aware of conscious entities of yourself. It's logical inference, by which you build rational arguments that would explain an emergentist thesis. That's not a predictability question. That's basic, building a rational, logical argument from non-conscious entities into conscious entities, right? So that's not really in the realm of predictability. I mean, if anything, that's like a retrograde. We're going back in evolutionary history and saying, well, how exactly did this magical emergence actually work? And that's sort of the burden that's being thrown on the physicalist. You have to explain that. If you can't explain it, you can't just say, well, somehow it happens, I don't really know how. That doesn't work. You have to give a plausible explanation in rational terms about how that works. If you can't, then you have no standing for your physicalist theory. I mean, that's as simple as I can put it, I think.
Well, so from my perspective, the methodology you just offered is one, an argument from ignorance, two, I forget what it's called now, but those seem to be the three fundamental fallacies that are used in pretty much every pseudoscience in all of humanity. It's like Christians use the same thing. We have logical arguments, we have introspection, and we have if you can't explain it, God did it. Those are the three things that justify God belief in the case of pretty much everything. And the same thing with say homeopathy, astrology. If you can't explain it, introspection.
I know this. I know what you're saying, right? I know what you're saying, right? Exactly. If you can't explain it, well, it must be true. Right, but I mean,
just clarify. I wanted to clarify one sec. So the argument here is that the methodologies that you've offered are methodologies that we know are unreliable, given my method. Given my method, that these three methods of determining truth, introspection, logical argumentation, and if you can't explain it, I'm right. Those three methods seem to be awfully wrong all the time, anywhere we apply them in reality. I don't see that these are reliable ways to try to establish whether or not anything is fundamental or anything is true, because when these methods are applied towards the things that we can test, they fail consistently. And so why would we trust these methods over the novel testable predictions method? Even if it doesn't give an answer in this case, it still seems like we probably shouldn't trust the methods that you're providing.
All the competing theories that you might want to throw out there, astrology and biorhythms and even God, right? These have plausible counter arguments. So if you want to say, well, God is out there and he's actively intervening in the physical laws of nature, and we can say, well, look, we don't see evidence of that because we have a complete physical explanation. We have no need for the God hypothesis, and you can argue from that from a physical standpoint. If you want to say, well, look, God is a moral being, he's all good, and he creates a moral universe, then you say, well, then you have the problem of evil. Well, so why does evil exist, right? This is a strong counter argument for the existence of a moral God. So we have rational counter arguments that say, if there's a God, we're not saying there's no God. There could be a God, and he just does nothing, and he sits up there in the clouds, and he does zilch. He's just sitting there watching the show. Okay, that's okay with me. He doesn't mess with the universe. He doesn't play with people's lives. He doesn't cause murderers to cause crime. Okay, because all those things don't make any sense, right? He doesn't. So that's what we can give a counter argument against a lot of these forms of theology and pseudoscience, if you will, because there are actual arguments against their existence. So it's not a comparable case to say, well, a panpsychist view is some kind of voodoo magical theological thing that's just boom, a new form of theology.
Oh right, that's not the claim I'm making. That's I want to be clear. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying specifically that the methods you're providing, the methods of introspection, logical argumentation, and if you can't explain it, I'm right. Those methods, we know, point to answers, which you're right, have lots of alternative counter arguments that disprove them. But the point is that these three methods that you're providing, you're saying these work as long as there's no counter arguments, or as long as there's no defeaters or something along those lines. And to me, that seems problematic because the question is whether or not these three methods can indicate true things more often than false things. And to do that, we can just ignore all of the counter arguments. We can ignore all of the counter data and say, if we're just using these methods, will these three methods be able to indicate true things more than false things? And the answer seems to be no, because when we use these methods, they will point to things that do have lots of counterarguments, that do have lots of defeating data. And so these methods that you provided don't seem to be able to indicate true things more than false things. Therefore, we should never trust these three methods, regardless of considering any counterarguments that may or may not exist, because these three things can't identify correct data independent of whether or not there's counterarguments.
Okay, so again, I think it's a little bit of a self-serving argument, right? Because you're using the rules that apply for objective empirical physical reality, and we're trying to apply those in a non-empirical, non-objective situation. And you could say, well, look, that holds for gods, and it holds for spirits, and it holds for souls, and it holds for minds, because all those things seem to be non-physical things. And I guess that is one point of commonality. Yeah, okay, if you're dealing with anything that's claimed to be non-physical, then you're going to have problems applying physicalist conceptions and physicalist arguments to non-physical things. Okay, that doesn't mean that they're true. It doesn't mean that they're not true. It just means that those tools and those conceptual approaches probably will not work when you apply them to non-physical things, right?
Well, I don't think that was my argument here. So my argument here is that ignoring the physicalist conception, this is just saying that you've posited a new methodology, and we want to know, does this methodology that you've posited work? So it has nothing to do with physicalism here. We're saying that you've posited this methodology of internal introspection, arguments, and if you can't explain it physically, that's evidence of my position. Now, we want to know, do these three things constitute a rational justification to believe true facts? And when we apply these things, it seems like a lot of people apply the exact same three principles to a lot of different things. And it seems like they can use these as justifications to try to believe God, astrology, homeopathy, UFOs, et cetera, et cetera. And we know many of those are false. And so it seems like these methods that you've applied are broken compasses. They don't rationally lead us to mostly true things. These things can lead us to lots of false things, and it seems to be predominantly false things. And now you're saying that yours don't have counter arguments. Those all have counter arguments or whatever. Right. Now that to me seems to be irrelevant, because we're trying to figure out, do these three things point to true things more than false things? And so whether or not a false thing has counter arguments doesn't seem to matter, because we want to know if these three methodologies you provided can rationally indicate truth more than falsehood, and it seems that they can't. And so therefore we probably shouldn't trust the three principles that you've provided as a means to indicate truth, independent of physicalism. Physicalism doesn't matter here. The point is that the methods you provided don't seem to be a rational indication of truth, because they can work equally as well for alternative hypotheses.
Yeah, but I mean, at some point you're stuck expanding beyond traditional physicalist arguments. I mean, there's lots of stories in history where philosophical or scientific insights that were true came to people in dreams, right? Sure. Or just some kind of hunch or intuition, right?
Yep.
And you could say, well, look, dreams are 90% crazy and, stupid stuff. But once in a while, some guy forms a dream and he gets a picture of a benzene ring, and it turns out to be true, right? Or some guy gets an intuition, some brilliant guy, just, Newton or somebody gets an intuition about something about gravity, and it turns out to be true. So, okay, yeah, sometimes these things which are physicalist kind of things about hunches and intuitions and dreams and whatever else you might want to throw in that kind of very fuzzy ballpark, sometimes those things are right, and some of our greatest scientific insights have come from those things.
Sure.
So in a sense, those things are neutral, right? I mean, a lot of times they give rise to nonsense, but sometimes they give to brilliant, truths that we accept about the world today.
Wait, I don't think that's neutral. So like, there's that phrase.
Sometimes they fail, sometimes they don't. I mean,
it's like occasionally even a blind squirrel will find a nut occasionally. Like the fact that a dream, like Ramanujan was a great example. He said that he got visions from the gods that gave him answers to the most complicated mathematical problems of the time that nobody could solve. He solved them. They were correct. Phenomenal example of exactly what you're saying. And I think that, yes, that is a very interesting case that needs to be taken account of, but that isn't evidence that therefore the methodology of appealing to the gods is good, because The other 7 billion or so religious people have not gotten that experience. And so the success rate of this methodology is 1 in 7 billion. This is not a great method that we should be using reliably. Can it work in one case? Absolutely. But it seems to work at the same rate as chance, which would prove that this is not a reliable methodology. And so it seems that if you're arguing that the same rationale should apply to your methods, that it can occasionally work in these very minute cases and fail in the majority of cases, therefore we should trust it. It seems like the opposite is the case. If it may work in 1 or 2 cases, but fails 90-something% of the time, we probably shouldn't trust it.
But the point is we're stuck, right? So if you're dealing with non-physical entities, your physicalist conceptions by definition are insufficient. So yeah, we might, really wish we had better, more solid approaches than we do. Rational arguments, logical inferences, the kind of things I've been talking about that panpsychists for centuries have used in their favor. And it's been some of the brightest people, by the way, in all of history. We didn't really go into that, right? But we got some of literally the most brilliant philosophers in history. They were panpsychists, and they had different reasons for thinking that. It's interesting to read the book, and you kind of see what they were thinking. So these guys who were like way smarter than you and me and the next 100 people combined, they had some kind of, I don't know what you want to call it, intuition or a feeling or, a logical inference. Sometimes they build actual arguments that something like panpsychism was true. So, you might say, well, I wish we had sort of more calculable, concrete, predictive, analytic methods. But like I say, those things are, sort of born in a physicalist conception. They work well in a physicalist universe, and they don't work well or arguably at all in non-physicalist entities. So we might wish we had something better. I'm not saying we rely on intuition and dreams. Those are just kind of some examples I was throwing out for discussion. But we do have logical arguments, rational arguments that we can construct based on empirical evidence of our own experientiality, our own conscious states, which is the ultimate starting point for all these discussions. So it is, in a sense, partly empirically based. It is a rational argument, and it's a question of not that I'm true, I'm right, and you're wrong, or this is true and this is false. It's a question of gradation of plausibility, which is what I was saying all along. It's a question of plausibility. What is the most plausible based on what we know today, based on the arguments that we can construct? I mean, a lot of it is that's how it's going to work in a non-physicalist universe, and today we have certain theories that are more plausible than others, and tomorrow or 10 years from now, maybe things change because we get some brilliant guy who comes along and he's got some new, even better, more plausible arguments or new ways to think about non-physical entities that will shed some new light, and we accept those things as being correct or true, maybe until the next brilliant guy comes along, and then we change it again. I mean, that's how the progression of knowledge goes. It's not just progression of science, it's progression of ontological, philosophical knowledge about what counts as reality in the universe that we're in. So you have to, we have to live with and work with these sort of less predictive, less mechanistic, less analytical positions and arguments to define what is most plausible at a given point in time. And I think maybe that's the best way to state it. Then you can use those same kind of arguments for crazy things, but well, okay. I mean, that's just the nature of how things work, right? It's like Aristotle working, 2,000 years ago, and everything was philosophy because he didn't have any real scientific tools at his disposal. And over time, the realm of, science expanded, the realm of philosophy sort of contracted down to certain things that are dealt with philosophically only, right? And so that's, I mean, you could say, well, I wish that wasn't true, or, maybe that'll change, and it probably will change. But for now, what we have to accept as true and valid and most plausible, again, that's really the key point. I think that's what we're stuck with. We're stuck using these tools, and we have to do the best that we can with the tools that we have.
Yep. So I would agree with that. I would just think that the tools that you're using have proven to be unreliable, and so we shouldn't trust them in this case. But I do want to go to the second question I had, which is why would positing that consciousness is fundamental be more plausible than saying it's strongly emergent? Because to me it seems, and I'm against strong emergence. I don't like strong emergence. To me it does seem like magic. But to say that it's fundamental, why would that be more or less rational than saying it's strongly emergent? What would be the epistemic difference in those two claims?
Because it doesn't involve magic. There's no miracles. It's a brute quantity like spin and charge and mass and space and time.
Well, why saying it's a brute quantity, fundamental in reality, any more plausible than saying it magically popped into existence at time t?
That's inherently a more rational position. I mean,
Why?
unless you're saying, well, God came up with a list of 6 things that he wanted at the Big Bang, and boom, 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 and consciousness. I guess you could kind of say that. But I mean, in a sense, we're stuck with fundamental entities. It's less crazy. Maybe there needs to be an argument. Maybe somebody needs to publish an article on that one. For in philosophers of mind, it's intrinsically less crazy to posit fundamental entities than it is to posit magical, miraculous emergence of things.
Right. I'm familiar with that, but my question is why? Because I don't understand why.
Well, when you allow miracles, then you can do anything. Then you can wave your hand and say, well, boom, this is that, and this is that, and there's invisible unicorns, and there's gods and goddesses, and then you can do anything if you allow miracles and magical mysteries to be part of your ontology. That's when you open the can of worms to all those things that you don't like, all those pseudoscience things.
But why can't you do that?
That's not allowed. That's not rational. It's more rational to posit something which you know is real to be fundamentally real. That's more plausible and more rational than to allow magical, miraculous mysteries to occur at some point in evolution, right?
What's the difference there? So, like, if I wanted to posit, say, if allowing strong emergence or whatever allows me to posit anything I potentially want, how is that different from saying I just posit whatever I want as a fundamental, as opposed to it being strongly emergent?
Because things that are evidently non-emergent don't seem to be plausibly emergent at some random point in evolutionary time. I mean, it goes back to, like, quantum fields or space and time. It doesn't seem plausible to say, there was a non-spatial universe, and then suddenly one day the universe, boom, woke up and it was spatial, or boom, it woke up and it was temporal. I mean, or there was no quantum fields for the first billion years of evolution, and suddenly, boom, there was quantum fields. Like, why would you say that? There's no reason to do that. It's completely arbitrary. You're picking some arbitrary point in evolutionary time to say, before this date, there was not quantity X, and after that there was quantity X, and I don't know why or how, but I just like that date. I like a billion years, ago, and I picked that date. I mean, that's just completely arbitrary. There's no basis for that whatsoever. It's much more plausible to say there were quantum fields at the beginning. There was space and time at the beginning, and then maybe we don't know why those were there, but it's more plausible to say they were there at the beginning. Then there was nothing, boom, and then this fundamental entity just shows up.
I'm still not understanding why exactly. I don't see the difference between the claims that it magically popped into existence at t equals 0 or it's always existed at t equals 0 versus magically popped at t equals 2. I don't understand why it would be more plausible to say it's always existed forever than it popped into existence at some time. I don't because either way you're positing some ontology that must exist in reality, and one, you're just saying it's always existed, and two, you're saying it popped into existence from nothing. And they both seem to be equally as arbitrary, because brute facts are pretty much arbitrary. They have no explanation by definition. And so if you're going to posit that an object exists as a brute fact in reality, like consciousness or whatever, I don't see that as any different than saying it popped into existence as a brute fact strongly emergent at time t.
Well, you're right. Both views are axiomatic. It's a presumption of a kind, right? So you're arguing about the basis of these axioms, right? Which is a more plausible one to presume. And I mean, I hear what you're saying. To me, it doesn't really make any sense to say, miracle emergence is more plausible than something being a fundamental entity. I don't know anybody.
I agree. So I'm saying they're the same. I'm saying those two would, to me, seem the same.
So you're saying it's a toss-up. So it's a toss-up between emergence and panpsychism. They're on equal.
Strong emergence. So I think strong emergence, the thing popping into existence from nothing, is epistemically the same as claiming something is fundamental. I think both of those entail the same kinds of ontological commitments, and so epistemically are about the same.
So I think we're making progress. So now you're saying panpsychism is equally plausible to the non-panpsychist
strong emergence.
Is that what I'm saying? Is that what you're saying?
Yes,
so I think we made progress, because you were up here before at the beginning, and now I think at least you're on equal footing, right?
Well, as I did mention before, I'm against strong emergence because I do think it's like magic. So I think both the position of strong emergence and the position of panpsychism are both terrible positions that we should not hold either one of them. I think weak emergence makes perfect sense. I think that's a good starting point, even if we can't explain it. But strong emergence, I think strong emergence is terrible, and I think panpsychism is probably pretty terrible too, because we're positing ontological entities seems like a kind of position that we don't have any kind of rational methodology to make justified as of yet.
And you're putting no weight in the fact that, you know, literally dozens of the most brilliant philosophers in history found intuitive plausibility in panpsychism.
No.
That carries no weight.
Absolutely zero, and that carries like negative weight. I feel like
just want to make that clear. Let's just make that clear. So we're smarter than Plato and Socrates and Schopenhauer and Spinoza and Leibniz, all those guys who are panpsychists. We're smarter than all those guys because their intuition was like they were just really off in left field in those cases.
I would say that humans are dumb. That would be my position. So even if we're not as smart as those people, the methodology they were using of intuition is a bad human methodology that no one should use ever under any circumstances. And so the fact that they used it would not make it any more plausible than the fact that you or I used it, because that methodology is terrible. And so if
they were too stupid to know that, because they put these things in writing. So they were too stupid to know that they shouldn't have relied on their own intuition. In fact, they did more than intuition. They actually built arguments in some cases. But you're saying they were too stupid to even know that they were wrong, and therefore, well, those guys have no credibility. So, okay. I mean,
well, I think it's more like I have intuitions as well, and I like my intuitions. Like I have intuitions about objective morality, but I know intuitions are not a reliable source of data. And so even though I accept for true and will make arguments for objective morality, because I intuitively think it's true, I know that it's not a plausible methodology to establish the objective truth of the facts. And we would need some other thing to do that later in future to make it plausible. And I think they would agree with that their intuitions are not good enough to establish.
It's a starting point. You got to build from there and see if you can construct a rational story about why that might be true. Yeah, exactly. That's what we see, in fact, many cases.
Yeah. Well, so cool. Yeah, that was it for the primary questions I had. We have been going for about, I think, an hour and a half. I'll check real quick. Yeah, we've been going for about an hour and a half. It was a great conversation. Really appreciate it. We do have a few questions from the audience.
Okay.
Efont says, I know this guy. He wrote a book about the philosophical problem with technology.
Yep.
What was that about?
That's a whole nother can of worms. We can talk about that in another show if you like. Yeah, I wrote a book called Metaphysics of Technology, which was a serious critique, a philosophical critique of technology. Metaphysics of Technology is published by Routledge in 2015. So, which actually has a kind of a funny connection to panpsychism. There's kind of an interesting ontology of technology, which, yeah, maybe we could talk about like that, like I say, in the future. So there is a kind of connection there, but yeah, just a different area of interest for me, I guess. So.
Stefan Burtis asks, does he have a premise conclusion argument? I think he wants a syllogism.
Syllogism here. Yeah, I mean the emergence, the anti-emergence argument can be put in syllogistic form. I guess, you know, I would say I generally don't try to spend a lot of time constructing analytic arguments. I don't find a lot of use in those, but some people do. I would refer you to Galen Strawson. Strawson wrote a very insightful piece called Realistic Monism, published in 2006, in which he basically constructs a syllogistic argument for panpsychism based on non-emergence. So I would refer any viewers to Strawson's work.
Efont asks, what is Dr. Scarbina's actual definition of consciousness?
So that's another question of dispute, right? How we're defining this kind of consciousness. I try to put it personally in very general terms as kind of a subjectivity, as a kind of awareness. I mean, you know, we use terms like qualia and so forth, the subjective feel of certain sensory impressions. So I think you know, because we have a hard time quantifying it and we have a hard time objectifying it, it can sound pretty fuzzy. So, you know, I generally don't even really like to talk about consciousness at all, because to me that sounds like too much like conscious awareness that humans have, and I want to talk about experientiality or mind in a more general form. So I try to avoid human-specific conceptions like consciousness or, you know, cognition, or these sort of higher level qualities that I think humans are generally considered to have. So, you know, I try to think about more fundamental things like desire or sensations or awareness. I try to speak more in those terms rather than strictly consciousness per se.
I like the I forgot his name. The guy's What It's Like to Be a Bat. That's
Yeah,
what
Nagel. Yeah, Thomas Nagel. Yeah,
the
right.
what it's
Exactly.
like to be something, what it's like ism.
What's it like? Right. There's this sense of it's like to be something, and right. He uses the fact that the bat can echolocate, and we can say, well, look, the bat has some kind of crazy mental states that we can't even conceive of, but we know that they're there, because we're not bats, and bats do those kind of things. So you could say, well, look, there are some sort of interesting mental states out there that can't relate to. We can't relate to simple organisms. We can't relate to inorganic organisms, but we can plausibly posit that there are mental states there, just that ones that we can't personally relate to because we aren't those kind of entities.
Gotcha. Next question is from the ungoogleable man. Is this guy a theist?
Theist? No. I mean, I don't consider myself an atheist. I like to think maybe there's gods and goddesses out there somewhere, sort of helping us out maybe behind the scenes, but no. So I mean, practically speaking, I guess functionally, I'm kind of an atheist in a sense. Certainly, there's no active God, there's no moral God, there's absolutely no basis for that. Um, so I'm basically a dual aspect monist, which kind of says, look, there's two aspects to reality. There's a physicalist aspect, there's a mental aspect. Those are dual parallel aspects of reality. Doesn't really allow a lot of room for theism in there. So I don't tend to spend a lot of time on that one, right? Unless I'm debunking Christianity, which is another thing I like to do, but that's a separate topic.
Me as well. That is mostly what I do on my channel. But that does sound a lot like dualism. You're saying there's two different things.
Well, there's a difference between dualism and dual aspectism, right? So dual aspectism is one thing which has two aspects, two dimensions, two sides, right? The typical story is like a coin. You got one coin, you have two sides of the coin, right? It's one thing, it's one coin, but it has two aspects to it. So I think maybe I've sort of argued that's maybe the most plausible kind of way to think about it. It's kind of a monistic view, which has these physical and mental aspects to them. So
What would be the monism in this case? Because like I'm a monist, obviously. I'm a physical materialist. I think everything's energy.
yeah.
But to me, it sounds like you're saying that there's matter and energy plus this other thing called consciousness. But if you're saying that they're two aspects of the same thing, that there must be some more fundamental thing that makes them both.
Yeah. So what is that one thing, right? Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it kind of exceeds our normal level, our normal vocabulary, right? It's not strictly physical because it has a mental aspect. It's not strictly mental because it has a physical aspect. I mean, you're sort of grasping at straws. Like how can you describe this thing? Schopenhauer, for example, was a famous dual aspect monist, and he said the will, that one thing, that one entity was the will. And the will solidifies itself and it becomes physical things. And the will is also a mental thing. It's kind of a will. It's a psychic thing as well. So, I mean, Spinoza had sort of his, he called it God or nature. His monist thing was kind of a panpsychism system, God or nature. He said, you can call it God, you can call it nature. It's a one monist entity. So, you got these interesting examples from history where this monist entity, this dual aspect entity, you can kind of refer to it from the mental side. You can refer to it from the physical side. There's different ways. I guess I don't have any particular preferred way to talk about that. Maybe that's something that needs to be elaborated in the future.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're saying that matter is fundamentally made of consciousness in some way. So it's kind of like an idealist position.
Well, I don't know. I mean, to me, it's like just the two sides, like two sides of a coin. I kind of see them as fundamentally equal. Maybe kind of a mirror image. I mean, I sort of like this idea of like looking into a mirror, where you have it's not like you have the object and the image. It's just like two images. You have the physical image and you have the mental image, and those things mirror each other. And that's a very old idea. It goes back to Spinoza, at least. And to me, that seemed like a fairly satisfying kind of picture, that you can associate every physical entity or event with a mental entity or event, and there's kind of a parallel structure there. So, I mean, I've argued for something like that as a plausible kind of view.
All right. Bjorn asks, would it actually change David's worldview if science eventually got a good understanding of consciousness?
So if there was a good scientific physicalist explanation of consciousness, we reduced consciousness to plausibly physical entities, I guess in principle, I'm open to that idea, right? I mean, who knows what's going to come up down the road? We have to be open to all those things. We need to be open to explanations for dark matter and dark energy and mental entities as well. So I guess in principle, I'm open to them. I'm not going to be an absolutist in any sense. I'm not going to claim I have absolute knowledge about these things. And yeah, sure, if we come up with some sort of brilliant new consumption yeah, conceivably, I guess I could count myself a physicalist someday if we have a kind of a nice way to reduce mental entities to physical things. Then yeah, I would be on board.
Cool. All right. Let's see. I think that was it for the comments. Let's check one more time. Yep, that looks like it. So thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate it. It was a great conversation. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find out more about your work?
You can go to davidskrbina.com. Excuse me, losing my voice here. But no, that's pretty much it for today.
Cool. Thanks again. Really appreciate it. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.